There are many ways to interpret the history of a civilization. One is economic. Nations rise through the accumulation of wealth, technology, and power, and decline when those material advantages erode. Another is political. Polities expand when their institutions function efficiently, and contract when corruption or sclerosis sets in. Yet, an older and more radical perspective regards civilization not primarily as a material or institutional process, but as a movement of the human spirit itself. Julius Evola, drawing upon the cyclical traditions of the ancient world, most notably the Eastern doctrine of the yugas and Hesiod's succession of metallic ages, argued that history is not a linear ascent. Civilizations undergo involution, a progressive descent from spiritual, hierarchical, and transcendent principles towards forms that are increasingly material, individualistic, and mechanical. Central to this vision is the traditional doctrine of the four castes, preserved most clearly in Vedic thought as the Varnas, the priestly sacral order, priests and sacred kings, guardians of transcendent wisdom and ritual authority. The warrior aristocracy, kshatriyas, embodiments of nobility, courage, and hierarchical command. The mercantile and productive class, vaishyas, oriented towards economic exchange and material increase. And finally, the mass of workers and servants, shudras, whose horizon is labor, consumption, and immediate necessity. In the highest sense, these castes stand in vertical hierarchy, each fulfilling its function under the primacy of the sacred. As involution advances, the lower castes progressively usurp the higher until the civilization is governed by purely quantitative, horizontal, and residual forces. This framework is philosophical rather than empirical historiography, yet it poses a precise question for England. Can we discern, across 15 centuries, a movement from a civilization ordered by sacred kingship and inherited tradition towards one organized around commerce, administration, and mass consumption? England's material achievements, global reach, scientific mastery, parliamentary continuity, and industrial primacy are not denied. The Evolan question is deeper. What kind of power replaced the older sources of meaning, and which castes successively dominated the soul of the people? The first stage corresponds to the primacy of the sacerdotal and regal function, the caste of priestly kings who mediate between the human and the transcendent. In Vedic terms, this is the Brahminical Kshatriya unity of the earliest ages. In Hesiod, the Golden Age in which men lived under divine law. In England, the nearest approximation appears in Anglo-Saxon society and high medieval Christendom. Political, social, and religious life formed a single continuum. The individual was not an autonomous economic agent, but a member of a cosmic order defined by duty, rank, and sacral obligation. Christopher Dawson observed that Christianity furnished medieval Europe with its cultural axis. Religion was not private conviction, but the formative principle of law, kingship, education, and identity. English kingship itself retained a sacred character. The coronation rite proclaimed that authority descended from above the person of the ruler. Ernst Kantorowicz's analysis of the king's two bodies captures this precisely. The monarch possessed both a mortal frame and a mystical body representing the perpetual realm. Alfred the Great exemplifies the type. His defense against the Vikings was inseparable from the restoration of learning, law, and Christian culture. The preface to his translation of Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care laments the decay of earlier wisdom and seeks its recovery, an explicit affirmation that civilization depends upon the preservation of a higher inheritance. Medieval England knew violence, hierarchy, and hardship. Its hierarchy of values, however, placed faith, honor, duty, and continuity above comfort or individual autonomy. Earthly institutions were understood as reflections of a sacred order. In Evolan terms, this was still a civilization in which the priestly-regal caste retained primacy. The second stage begins when sacred foundations weaken, while the warrior aristocracy still holds formal command. Traditional structures persist, yet authority becomes increasingly horizontal and political. In Vedic correspondence, this is the Kshatriya age, noble, hierarchical, yet already detached from pure spiritual orientation. Tudor England marks this transition. This period forged administrative efficiency, military strength, and the foundations of later empire. Simultaneously, it severed the medieval unity of spiritual and temporal power. Henry VIII's break with Rome subordinated the church to the national state. What had been a transnational sacerdotal order became the instrument of royal policy. Geoffrey Elton's studies of Tudor government demonstrate the emergence of a more bureaucratic, centralized machinery, authority oriented less towards transcendence than towards the efficient exercise of state power. The older aristocratic ethos of land, honor, and service began to accommodate commercial realities. Lawrence Stone charted how the English nobility adapted to economic management without yet surrendering its warrior identity. Overseas trade, colonial enterprise, and early financial institutions expanded, yet the dominant caste remained the aristocracy. The direction of movement, however, was clear: from vertical sacred order towards worldly political power. When the Industrial Revolution accelerated, the third caste, the merchants and producers, assumed cultural hegemony. In Vedic terms, this is the Vaishya age, in which calculation, exchange, and material accumulation displace both sacerdotal wisdom and warrior nobility. Hesiod's Bronze Age offers a parallel, an epoch of restless labor and metallic hardness. By the 19th century, Britain stood at the center of the world economy. Factories, railways, finance, and global trade reconstituted society more thoroughly than any prior transformation. From a conventional standpoint, this was progress of the highest order. From an Evolan standpoint, it was the decisive triumph of economic man. The central figure was no longer priest, king, or warrior, but the economic individual defined by production, consumption, and exchange. Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation describes how the market detached itself from the moral and communal matrices that had previously contained it. Economic calculation began to organize society itself. Traditional communities dissolved. Labor was severed from craft identity. Cities swelled with uprooted populations. Charles Dickens recorded the human cost. Thomas Carlyle denounced the reduction of men to cash nexus. Even Marx, from an opposing premise, diagnosed the same alienation: human relations mediated by commodities. Britain acquired unprecedented material power. The question remained whether that power had been purchased at the price of spiritual depth. The fourth stage is the dominion of the residual caste, the Shudras, the mass of workers, functionaries, and consumers, in which organic hierarchy dissolves into quantitative organization. In the Kali Yuga of Hindu tradition, and in Hesiod's Iron Age, this is the epoch of fragmentation, in which no higher principle retains living authority. Post-1945 Britain exhibits the characteristic marks. 2 world wars shattered the imperial framework that had still carried a residual civilizational mission. Decolonization removed the external projection of British identity. What remained was increasingly economic and administrative self-definition. Peter Mayer's Ruling the Void diagnoses the parallel hollowing of political parties, churches, and intermediary institutions. Organic belonging yields to abstract systems. Secularization completed the loss of transcendence. Steve Bruce and Charles Taylor have mapped the passage from a world in which belief of God was the default condition of social existence to one in which such a belief is merely one private option among many. Morality persists, yet its depth and stability, once detached from sacred foundations, become open questions. Simultaneously, the managerial and consumer apparatus expanded. Max Weber's rationalization, the replacement of traditional authority by systems of efficiency and technical expertise, created Weber's iron cage. The operative criteria shifted. Not, is it noble, but does it work? Not, is it beautiful, but is it efficient? Not, does it transmit inheritance, but does it raise productivity? Roger Scruton repeatedly insisted that traditions and rituals embody forms of knowledge irreducible to planning. Mass society completes the pattern. David Reisman's Other-Directed Individual and Christopher Lasher's Culture of Narcissism describe a self whose identity is shaped by external signals, markets and media, rather than by inherited form. Family, religion, locality and rank lose authority. In their place stand markets, bureaucratic systems and personal identity projects. The individual is liberated from tradition and simultaneously severed from the sources that once conferred meaning. The Shudra principle, quantity without qualitative hierarchy, prevails. An Evolan reading does not claim that modern Britain is simply inferior in every measurable respect. Life expectancy, scientific knowledge, legal equality, and material standards have advanced beyond the imagination of earlier centuries. Every civilization involves trade-offs. The medieval world possessed spiritual unity and lacked modern freedoms. The industrial world generated wealth and social dislocation. The contemporary world multiplies individual autonomy while struggling to sustain collective purpose. The directional pattern remains, from the primacy of the priestly-regal caste, through the warrior aristocracy, through the mercantile order, down to the residual mass. This is not random change, but involution, the progressive inversion of the traditional hierarchy of values. Evola himself was austere. Late civilizations cannot simply restore earlier forms. History does not reverse. A modern society cannot recreate the conditions of Alfred's England. Yet, renewal is not thereby excluded. Arnold Toynbee observed that civilizations endure when the creative few respond to challenge by recovering forgotten principles, rather than by merely conserving obsolete institutions. For Britain, this would require more than growth or technical refinement. It would demand answers to questions that technology cannot settle. What traditions still carry living authority? What obligations bind the living to the unborn? What values resist reduction to economic calculation? What is the purpose of the national existence beyond consumption and administration? These are questions of philosophy, historical memory, and cultural will. Viewed through the four-stage model and the corresponding doctrine of castes, England's history appears as a long descent, from a medieval order centred upon priestly kingship and sacred hierarchy, through an aristocratic national state in which warrior ideals still commanded, through an industrial commercial civilization dominated by mercantile principle, to a modern society of secularization, managerial systems, mass culture, and residual individualism. Whether or not one accepts Evola's ultimate conclusions, the framework compels a serious inquiry. Modern civilization has achieved extraordinary mastery over the external world. Mastery of the external does not automatically yield mastery of the self. A society may possess wealth, technology, and elaborate institutions, yet remain uncertain of its ultimate purpose. The decisive question for England's future is therefore not whether it can become richer or more efficient. It is whether it can remember that civilization requires more than organization. It requires meaning, and history suggests that civilizations do not endure merely by increasing their power. They endure by knowing what that power is for.